At a time when so many of us feel like our connections with people are distant and conversations surface level, really engaging with each other takes intention. I'm Ashley Gould, the founder of Attend, an everyday luxury home brand with products that set the table for meaningful spaces and gatherings. Our podcast builds on those spaces through dynamic discussions with open-hearted people, with the goal of sparking conversation around your table. In this series, we explore how designed spaces impact our lived experience and day-to-day life. Our aim is to help you understand what makes a space fulfilling and provide a scientific framework along with expert insights to help you create spaces that enhance your well-being. We delve into the entire spectrum of designed spaces, from our brain's relationship with aesthetics to finding the right designers, lighting systems, and objects that support your well-being. Ultimately, we examine how the spaces we inhabit can enrich our ability to be present and connect with others. Join us.
Welcome to episode 5 of the From Brain to Home series with guest Yvonne Jewkes. This is part 2 with Yvonne. If you haven't listened to part 1, we definitely recommend you go and do so before listening to this episode. Also, a quick note to our listeners, there is mention of assault partway through this episode. If you'd like to skip that section, it starts around minute 20 and ends around minute 23. Enjoy.
Your memoir intertwines your professional work with your personal experience of renovating a home left unfinished by your ex-husband. Can you share, and I think you're pretty open about this, but can you share your personal story for listeners and the similarities you noticed between your work and your personal life and what inspired you to center your memoir around this connection?
Sure. So, the title of my book, An Architecture of Hope, has wider meaning than simply improving the design of prisons, because, as you say, throughout the professional narrative that I tell about my career researching in prisons and helping to design them, is woven a personal narrative, a personal story about the end of a long relationship and my changing relationship with my home. So, my partner of 25 years left me, which was quite bad. I didn't see it coming. But worse than that, he left me with a house that he had destroyed. It was a 200-year-old townhouse, and it was supposed to be a renovation project. But it turned out that my ex-partner was better at destruction than construction or reconstruction. I mean, basically, he had no experience. We bought this house. We knew that it was a big project. He hadn't done anything like it before. And it eventually overwhelmed him and he bailed out. But, for 11 years, we lived on a building site and there was so much chaos. And, I describe it as violence at home because the destruction was all pervasive. The dirt, the dust, the noise, the feeling of being trapped. And then later, during lockdown, which was when I started writing the book, my home had become a sanctuary. After my ex left, I took on the renovation myself, and I did more in 18 months than he'd managed in the previous 11 years. So my home had become a sanctuary, but it was still one of confinement. We were locked down. It's the closest that most of us will get to experiencing the kinds of conditions that prisoners do in terms of the fact that our freedom was curtailed, our movement was limited and so on. And I realised that I'd created a beautiful prison and I had no meaningful escape from it. And then 18 months after he left, we had quite an amicable relationship for quite a long time. But 18 months after he left me, he moved back into my street and moved in with one of my neighbours, another woman, directly opposite me. And so, I talk about all of that in the book. I talk about what it's like to find yourself suddenly single in midlife as a woman. I talk about how confinement comes in many different guises. But I also talk about how I found freedom. And, all of that was quite difficult to write about, especially as an academic, because ostensibly I've written a book about prisons, which means that, lots of my academic colleagues will pick it up and read it for that reason, and they'll find out all the sort of the sordid secrets of my personal life. You have to do that. When you write memoir, you can't go into it half-heartedly. And I ended up just thinking, the strength in vulnerability. I hadn't been going to tell the story of my ex moving in opposite me because I was carrying so much shame and humiliation about that. And then I just ended up thinking, no, the shame and humiliation are his. And actually, it was when I wrote that story into the book that the whole narrative fell into place. Suddenly I had a narrative arc. And it was a very cathartic experience, actually.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you found the freedom? And then, we see your new house behind you. So I know that that's part of it, but tell us that story.
I found freedom through friendships, through travel. The thing that I realised was when you're part of a couple, when you're someone's other half, you make so many compromises. And I think for women in particular, we allow our freedom to be curtailed. We tend to sort of be the ones that make the compromises. So I bought a rail ticket that allowed me to go all over Europe very cheaply. And I did that. I just took myself off on my own and visited some amazing places. And I talk about, going to Venice and Bologna and various other places in the book. But I think I really, my book has two main aims. One is to forge an understanding of prisons and prisoners among people who might not usually think of who we send to prison, and to try and elicit some kind of fellow feeling, the notion there, but for the grace of God, could go any of us. The other main aim was to write something that was inspiring for women of my age in particular, to sort of say, if your relationship has ended, or if you're in a relationship that has grown tired, everything in society encourages us to think that being in a couple is the ideal state. And we're so terrified of being on our own. It's a big deal. I talk in the book about my learned helplessness. My immediate thought when my partner told me he was leaving me was, how do you put the bins out? I didn't know how to take the trash out. And I wanted to really say to other women who find themselves in a similar situation, men as well, but particularly women, there is life on the other side of a long relationship. And it can be a much more vivid, interesting, colourful, enriching life than you could ever have thought possible. It goes back to my answer to your first question about what kind of kid was I. And it's amazing to me that in my 50s, I've written my first book, and all those lovely things that go around that, like doing this podcast, going to literature festivals, doing media interviews, and actually having quite a few people, complete strangers, send me messages, email me, saying they loved my book and it's made a difference to them.
Do you think that the 11-year destruction process and living in that chaos, talking about sort of neuroaesthetics in your built environment, I cannot imagine that did not have a negative impact on your relationship. I mean, it could have been other things, but do you think that the physical space was a meaningful part of the eroding of your relationship?
I think so, yeah. I used to blame everything on the house. When things didn't feel like they were going well in my life, I would just think, if only we could get the house finished, then everything would be tranquil and perfect. And actually, I was looking in the wrong place. I should have been looking at the relationship. My partner used to get very prickly and defensive if I challenged him about the length of time that it was taking him to renovate the property. So I stopped doing it. And I look back on myself now and think, I could have been more assertive. I could have been more demanding, actually. But I was abroad a lot. I was working in Australia and New Zealand. I was away a lot. I was also, I now realise, quite depressed, I think. Mm. And in fairness to my partner, I think I probably wasn't much fun to live with a lot of the time. I used to go out to work in the mornings and I'd look down and I'd be wearing a nice business suit or something, and it would be covered in brick dust. My shoes would be covered in dust. I would have dust in my eyelashes. It was miserable. It was just a really horrible way to live. And of course, that must have impacted on our relationship. I don't know. I wish we could have communicated about it a bit more. But actually, I've ended up not regretting anything. My only slight regret is that I think we should have finished our relationship a bit sooner, a few years earlier. I would have liked a bit more of a run at this new life of mine. But, on the whole, I'm not one for looking back. I always look forward. So, everything that's happened since then has been positive, and it continues to be, and I'm really looking forward to the next chapter of my life.
I think that's wonderful. My older son is a senior in high school, so we'll be going off to college, and we had lunch yesterday just to talk about making the decision of where to go for college and really starting to talk about, what do you want out of life? And just starting to consider that. He's relatively young for that, but still, I think it's always good to think about things. And what does it mean to have a life of meaning? And what do you want to do with your life? And I think what happens to a lot of us is that we get on a path and we stop thinking. We're just on the path.
Absolutely.
And we stop saying, should I turn left or right? We just put our heads down, and we can consider making the turn left or right at any time in our lives. I think people forget that. And I think your book is a wonderful reminder of that. I like to look back only to learn, not to say I wish I had done it differently or to dwell on negative things. But I do think we need to learn from the past because it helps us make better decisions in the future. And I really do sort of going back to your built environment, and I want to hear about your new house, but it does affect us. Our surroundings affect us, and having the dust and the destruction. And I think almost nobody that would not affect in a negative way.
For 11 years, actually.
For 11 years. So I do think it's great to learn from that. And even if it's just to say, we should have called it a couple of years earlier, which is hard to do, right? It's hard when you're in a relationship for a long time. I think it's hard to do that. But tell us about your new home, how you found it, what you love about it, how it makes you feel.
I found it, a friend found it for me, actually, my friend Harry. I had dinner with him in Bath, which is where I now live and where I work. He's a professor of global public health at the university, and we started on the same day, so we've been good friends all the way through. And we had dinner, and I was telling him about the amount of work that I still needed to do on my old house and how much money it was going to cost. And I said I'd spent quite a lot of money on buying my ex-partner out so I could keep the house. So I had a huge mortgage, and I still had at least £200,000 to spend on the final renovations. And the house was just a money pit. It was just a complete money pit. And I was telling Harry about it, and I was telling him how much my mortgage was and how much the bills were. And he just said, Yvonne, it's a no-brainer. Just move. And he showed me this house in a village close to Bath, which he knew about because it used to be owned by the friend of his mother-in-law. And he got it up on his phone and he showed me the pictures. And he said, somewhere like this would be great for you. And it really appealed to me because this house is nothing like my old house. And one of the things that had put me off moving from Cheltenham, where I was, to Bath, is that the architecture is very similar. And I didn't want to move to another Regency period or, Georgian period house with high ceilings and huge sash windows. And, as lovely as all that was, I'm sort of done with the whole Jane Austen vibe. And this house is very different. It's also quite old. It's not as old. It was built in about 1890, but it's a worker's cottage. That's what it was built as. So it's in a terrace. It's tucked in the corner. It's the hinge of an L-shaped terrace. When I came to see it, I immediately recognised that sort of Scandinavian vibe. Also very mid-century in terms of the furnishings that she'd chosen, and I really liked that as well. And it just spoke to me. I talk about the fact that my old house, I was convinced that there was trauma in the walls. I used to think, well, how could there not be? A 200-year-old house, that all the occupants that have lived there through 2 world wars, all the births and deaths that have taken place under that roof. When I came to see this house, I felt that it had been loved and that it gave love out. I did feel it, and I still do. Me and my house were the subject of an article in a national newspaper, the Financial Times Weekend, recently, and a lovely journalist came to see it, and he described it as having the feel of a Nordic boathouse in a fjord, which, I thought, well, I'll go with that. It's tiny compared to my old house. It's a third of the size. But I got rid of nearly all my stuff, all the stuff that held memories and all that emotional baggage of that failed relationship. I gave it away. I sold a few bits. I sold some bits to the people that bought it. And I just wanted to start with a clean slate and start afresh. And that's what I've done. And honestly, it was the best decision I've ever made. I love living in Bath. I live in this beautiful village called Larkhall, which is idyllic. And it's my sanctuary. This is all my own. I love the fact that I live alone. I haven't had to make any compromises. I feel very blessed, actually, very privileged to live here.
Well, it absolutely shows. I mean, you're glowing in your space and you're just very comfortable there. So, I mean, well done.
Thank you.
And you had to take a leap to do it, right? I mean, and most important things in life, we have to sort of get out there on a limb a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I've lived here for exactly a year this week, and I was trying to remember how I felt on that morning that I was moving, and I have no recollection. I've just kind of blanked it out. I imagine I was really stressed. But going back to what you were saying about your son, I've just read a book by Oliver Burkeman called 4,000 Weeks. And it's basically a self-help book, but it's got a bit of psychology and philosophy in it. But the basic premise of it is that we have, if we're lucky, an average lifespan, we have 4,000 weeks on this planet. And it's all about how do you want to spend that time? How do you want to make a meaningful life for yourself? And I reckon that if I'm lucky, I've got about 1,000 weeks left. And that really focuses the mind. And,
yes, it does.
And I think about it in relation to my home, how I want to live in this space, who I want to invite into it. All of that it's become very important to me.
I couldn't agree more. And I was recently on somebody's podcast and, talking about starting, I was a lawyer for 20 years, starting this company and this podcast. And it's all the things you're talking about. It's, we don't know how much time we have left. And I think as we get older, and I'm 50 now, we spend a bit more time thinking about that. And how do we want to spend the time we have left? And what do we want to do with it? And how do we make it meaningful? And there's something about having the 1,000 weeks or less that helps focus the mind in a very positive way. People can think of aging as a negative, but there are a lot of positives that come with it as well.
I would much rather be a woman in our 50s today than 50 years ago, that's for sure. I think we have so many more options and opportunities available to us. And if we are confident and we can make those big leaps into the unknown, there's never been a better time. I mean, being a debut author in my mid-50s just feels absolutely incredible. I feel as if I'm at the vanguard of something, but I see people all around. In fact, I just read this morning that there's a new literature festival starting that will focus on new authors over the age of 50 in the UK. I don't know quite how I feel about that. That's a bit double-edged for me. But I think we're onto something. The power is ours if we choose to take it.
So going back to this whole idea that can walls talk and whether they can hold trauma and memories, so the last series I did on my podcast was on death and dying. It was 10 years since I lost my father to a rare cancer, and I feel like death is probably the ultimate subject we don't talk about. Prisons are probably a pretty close second, but death is probably like the top one. And it was very, very interesting to delve into it. And I think it is extremely beneficial for us all to face mortality and really think about the life we want to live and the death we want to have. But I read a book that one of my guests had suggested called The Smell of Rain on Dust by Martine Prechtel, which is a book about grief. The book is a bit woo-woo, like it gets a little bit woo-woo and you have to be sort of hang in for it. But I thought there were some really interesting concepts. Martine talks about this whole idea of unexpressed grief and pain that can be held through generations until it's intentionally stopped. And he talks a lot about communal grieving rituals, but I think there are lots of ways people can sort of move through grief. But I was thinking about that, both your personal story and then prisons where you've spent 30 years of your professional life. And how do we get rid of unexpressed grief in a prison? Or the trauma that clearly has to be there? Is that something that you've looked at or researched or thought about?
I've thought about it in relation to Oasis Restore, the children's secure school that we were talking about earlier, because the buildings that Oasis were given by the Ministry of Justice, they'd been the subject of a TV programme, investigative journalism. Someone went undercover to film the brutality that went on in Medway, assaults by staff on children, very serious assaults, on very damaged children. Children were locked up for extremely long periods. The abuses were horrible. And I have thought a lot about the trauma in those walls and how much better it would have been if the government had said to Oasis, you can build from scratch, build from the ground up, build something new. To build in the shell of something where horrific things have happened just doesn't seem to make sense to me on any level. I think it also about that question about do we preserve or demolish in relation to buildings that horrible things have happened in. And by the way, it does sound woo-woo, but the great architectural theorist John Ruskin believed that architecture had an ability to hold memory. So I figure if it's all right for Ruskin to say it, it's all right for the rest of us. But, I started writing, it ended up not being in my book, it ended up sort of on the cutting room floor. But I talked about a house that was only 9 miles away from where I lived in my former home, where very bad things happened. It was a very notorious criminal case in this country, Fred and Rosemary West. I don't know if that means anything to American listeners. But in the 1970s and 80s, at least 11 young women were incarcerated, tortured, raped and murdered in the basement of this very ordinary-looking terraced house in a city called Gloucester in England, including one of their own daughters. When the crimes were discovered, the decision was made that the house would be demolished. And it was, and the rubble was taken away, and in its place is a little sort of pathway with bollards at the end so that, cars can't go down. So there was no trace for ghoulish souvenir hunters or whatever. But for me, this is a really complex issue when it comes to grieving, because I wonder, is there a danger that raising buildings to the ground, buildings that disturb us, does that erase the memory of what happened in them? Is that respectful or disrespectful to the victims? I'm not sure. And then I was thinking about it in contrast. There are 2 houses in northwest London where another notorious serial killer called Dennis Nielsen murdered at least 12 young men and boys between 1978 and 1983. Those 2 houses are still standing and they're still lived in. And Nielsen's crimes were every bit as horrific as the West's in Gloucester. He was a trophy hunter, he was a cannibal, a necrophiliac, all the bad stuff. But I have asked myself, why was the site in Gloucester demolished, but the sites in London not demolished? Is it simply that London's population is more transient, more atomised, more anonymous? So, there isn't perhaps the same sense of a community ripped apart, which there would be in a place like Gloucester. Or is it simply because of the value of real estate in the capital? Are those houses actually too valuable to be demolished and erased? So, yeah, I think I don't have any answers to that. But it's a really interesting set of issues that it raises.
I mean, my sensibility about it after reading Martine's book and thinking a lot about grief, I know much less about sort of the trauma, the kind of trauma you're talking about, but grief is pretty traumatic in and of itself. And I do think that it has more to do not with the physical space as much as with our own emotional state and what we allow to affect us. So I just read another book called The 4 Things That Matter Most that another one of my guests has suggested. It's written by a palliative care doctor who obviously has worked with many dying people and their families. And the 4 things that he says we need to discuss with anybody in our life who we love and or with whom we have a substantial relationship. It could be a fraught one, like your ex, for example. The 4 things are: forgive me, I forgive you, I love you, and thank you. And maybe the most profound thing I learned in this book is that you don't have to feel forgiveness to give forgiveness. But when you hold on to something, you're hurting yourself. And when you forgive, you're letting it go. And I think that this concept of trauma in the walls is similar. Like, we have to let things go and we have to figure out how to let them go. You did it by moving. I do think moving physically was part of your healing process. And I think we all have to find our way. What is our way of letting go and healing?
I should say, Ashley, that I was quite stubborn. I didn't move because my ex had moved in opposite me. I waited until he had moved. It was strangely important for me to stay in that house while he was living opposite, because I didn't want the feeling of being driven out of my home. So, yeah, it's so interesting what you say. If I had been able to find forgiveness earlier, I might have been able to make a new start on my life earlier. The selling of the house and the writing of the book were inextricably linked in a way that I didn't understand at the time. There was a kind of alchemy in process. I think writing the book was a long process of separation from the house, and I only realised that in hindsight. That book is written as a love letter to that house. And all the time I was writing it, I could not have conceived of ever leaving the house. You know, I had a peculiar attachment to it. And then a week after I finished the final version of the manuscript and sent it to my editor, I put my house up for sale. And I sort of took myself by surprise in that. But I now look back on it and think that's what all of that needed to happen. You know, it was a process of alchemic separation. I think there's a process where people who suffer very badly from burns, there's some kind of chemical that they can lie in a bath, but it would mean that the burned skin would very slowly peel off. If they just kept motionless, absolutely still, it would separate. And I sort of, you know, that's a very powerful image in mind. It took me 3.5 years to write the book. And I feel that skin was being shed. All the hurt, all the harm and the bitterness and the lack of forgiveness came out in the bath. It all came off me. And then I was free to put the house up for sale and move and make a new life.
When do you spend the most time with the people you love? For us, it's at home, around the dinner table with family, or sipping cocktails in the living room with friends. So why not make that time even more meaningful by imbuing your gatherings with pieces that not only make connecting easier, but spark conversation around your table? Amaton's collection of small batch, artisan, quality-made pieces for tabletop and home are not only made for simple serving, they're works of art designed for daily use. Whether you're hosting a dinner party or sitting down for family game night, our collections create a sense of presence and peace in every home. Shop our collection of dinnerware, drinkware, serveware, and more at amatond.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com. Gather by design.
Well, I think this is a really interesting sort of segue or discussion about confinement generally. So in your work, both your professional work and then your personal story, there's a sense of physical confinement, or, I mean, your house wasn't confinement, but it was oppressing you, I think, in some way.
Yeah, for sure.
And certainly in prisons, there's physical confinement. And then there's intellectual and emotional confinement. And perhaps it's all intellectual and emotional confinement at the end of the day. And it's working through that to sort of get to freedom, as you call it. Yeah. Are there any uplifting stories of prisoners that you've worked with or known? And I know you're writing a book with one prisoner who hopefully will actually come on the podcast, either furthering their education, giving back to society while imprisoned. And do you think your redesigns or your work has anything to do with that?
That's a big question. I mean, I've seen many, many examples of prisoners who have changed in prison, not necessarily as a result of the environment or anything in particular that the prison's done. But I think Nick's a good example, actually. I am a writer in residence at the prison that he used to be held at, a high security prison called Grendon. And I run a creative writing class there with my friend and colleague Andy West, who's also written a prison-themed memoir. And Nick was one of our students, and actually I met him at a University Open Day that the prison holds, which again is really unusual. So Grendon it calls itself a democratic therapeutic community prison. And that means that you have to apply to go there as a prisoner. You undergo really intensive therapy, and everything there is done democratically. So, all decisions from, what we have for dinner to even recruiting new prison officers. There will be a prisoner who sits on the panel, the interview panel for new prison officers. So it's a very unusual place. Nick was allowed to, as they all are, allowed to decorate his own cell at Grendon, and he made it very homely. And he painted it, and he painted the floor to look like marble. Really clever. The book that we're writing now is about his life, or his lives. He and I, we've discovered, had ostensibly very similar backgrounds. Both had alcoholic fathers, both had strong-minded, ambitious mothers. We were both one of four. In terms of, social class and status, very, very similar. We went to uncannily similar schools. I mean, both quite weird schools, actually, but very historic. My school was founded by Henry VIII in 1541 or something, and his school was founded by Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth I. And so we're really interested in exploring why it was that these two people, again, he was also bright and curious, but underachieving at school. Why did one of us end up taking that path to become a criminology professor and the other become a heroin addict and an armed robber? And, so we're telling that story. How did that happen? But also the story that pertains to his rehabilitation, which happened at Grendon through therapy. And, he discovered a talent for art. He's a really talented painter. He's a great writer. He's a journalist. He writes a regular column for the prison newspaper, Inside Time. He's a talented musician. And yet he spent 20 of his years in jail. He's only 46. He spent the majority of his adult life in prison. He was quite a prolific armed robber. But, all of that's so interesting to me because actually he got lucky in being at a prison that had not only me and Andy as writers in residence, but had a really great artist in residence as well. And it was only during lockdown that Nick discovered that he had this talent for painting. And now he paints to commission. He paints portraits of other prisoners' children and their mums and things like that from photographs. And he makes a bit of money out of doing that. And I'm really enjoying writing the book with him. He's a great collaborator and we're having a lot of fun with it. All those years wasted. I said to him once, did you spend your 21st birthday in prison? And he said, yeah, and my 30th, and my 40th. It's such a waste. And hopefully he'll be out by the end of this year. I think he has so much to offer a society. He spent decades in prisons where he was essentially just warehoused, that didn't give him any sort of channels to explore his potential, his talents. And eventually he applied to Grendon and he got the help that he needed and he's completely turned his life around.
And, so there are still like these beautiful moments.
Real sliding doors moments.
Right? And he took advantage of that. Some people never do. Maybe more don't than do in life. So there's still something to be grateful for. And it's a beautiful story. And I will definitely look forward to reading that book when it comes out. What's the timeline?
Don't know. We're still just writing sample chapters to send to my literary agent.
You mentioned the impact that sensory experience has on the feelings of a home, which is a cornerstone of neuroaesthetics. You give one example of a prisoner who saw a pink rhododendron outside his cell window, and he cried because he had these flowers in his garden at home, and seeing them blossom made him feel like he was at home. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of color, texture, and touch on building a home, and then also in your prison redesigns, and the emotional resonance that these sensory experiences can have or lack when prisoners, for example, are deprived of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, if we relate it to our own lives, I remember even as a child thinking, I hope that one day I'm rich enough to be able to afford to buy flowers, fresh flowers, and candles all the time. And I am now comfortable enough to be able to do that. That story about the rhododendron really resonated with me, because if I buy some, peonies or hydrangeas and put them in a lovely vase, they lift my spirits. You can imagine, if you're in a prison environment where everything is painted that awful institutional grey-green colour, and there's no sort of stimulation, there's no sensory stimulation, there are no interesting textures or uneven horizons. Life is bland. And I feel this quite strongly more widely as well. When I see some of the new housing estates being built around the UK, modern housing schemes seem to be all about value engineering, is what architects call it, building as cheap as possible, cutting corners where possible, designing tiny flat pack boxes with small windows and minuscule gardens, and they all look the same. And it seems to me that there's a gap between the design talent and vision, certainly in the UK, and the end result of contemporary housing. So I'm not totally an advocate of just trying to replicate the past. I'm not saying that we should be building today what they were building 200 years ago. But I do think that living somewhere, as I did, that has seen the comings and goings of living occupants for 200 years, gave me a deep appreciation of my home's history. And, I was always more interested in my house's history than I was my own family genealogy. There was a local historian that lived a few doors down, and he gave me the research that he'd done of every single person that had lived in that house for the whole 200 years, from the builder right through to me. And that was fascinating. And I can't help thinking that we must start to build homes that people want to stay in for a long time, not move away from. And, that means building with a sort of human feeling, some sort of sensibility other than cost, building as cheaply as possible. So, yeah, that doesn't really answer your question. But for me, a beautiful piece of art, whether it's in my home or in a prison, is good for the soul. It nurtures the soul.
I agree. Well, let me ask you this. What, after everything you've been through with the renovation and the new house, and what does home mean to you? Is it a physical space, a feeling, something we carry within us, all of the above?
Yeah, my book is a meditation on the meaning of home. I really thought a lot about what home means to people, and I hope that it encourages readers to think about what home means to them. So I explore many different aspects of it. Many people still call the house that they grew up in and that their parents still live in home. And as I said, I had a peculiar attachment to my last home. I had an unusual family situation. I was an only child till I was nearly 16, and then my parents had 3 more children. And I talk a little bit about that in my book, because I wonder if that partly explains why I have this really quite unusual attachment to home. I didn't have a home for a while because my bedroom was needed for the youngest, my little brother. And so I left home to go to university, and I basically couldn't go back. There was nowhere for me. So I felt like a cuckoo in the nest, really. I felt quite usurped. And I think that's why I have this really deep sense of the importance of home to me now. I don't know if home and confinement can coexist. I think most of us do carry an essence of home within us, but being forcibly removed from our homes must surely exacerbate a sense of loss. And I think, That's a huge question of geopolitics at the moment, people being forcibly removed from their land, from their homes, as well as a small question about the bricks that we live within. But as I say, the house I live in now has a different feel to my former home. And the meaning of home now for me, as it is for many people, many women in particular, is all about safety and security and just a sense of well-being, I think.
Yeah.
When you're home, right?
Absolutely. Well, I really feel like, so it's interesting. My mom and stepdad still live in the house that I grew up in. My stepmom still lives in the house where she and my father lived for many, many years. And I've had several houses, but I have not felt like an affinity or an attachment to the houses. My husband and I are currently building a house, and so we have chosen literally everything. So it will be interesting to see once we move in if I feel differently about that. For me, so far, home has been something more within than a physical space. However, my physical space, my home matters to me. No matter what home it is, the colors, the textures, the lighting, those things affect me quite a lot, but it's not like a tie to a specific physical space, if that makes sense. So to me, that is part of a sense of home. So creating a feeling, which for me is like peace and comfort in my home, in the space that I physically live in, is very important and more important to me than it being this house or that house, if that makes sense.
It does completely. And I also detect from what you're saying is that a sense of home in your relationship, which I think most people, if we're lucky, we do. And I did for a long time. Just because I'm bitter and cynical about long-term relationships now doesn't mean to say that I can't recognize the fact that you're building a house together. There's multiple layers of the meaning of home within that.
Absolutely, yes. And I do feel very fortunate. It's funny, I was talking to my older son about this too, about thinking about, do you think you want to get married? Do you think you'll want to have children? And talking a bit, which I think we don't do enough of, what does it take to have the best success rate at a long-term relationship? Because my parents were divorced when I was quite young, and it was actually one of my objectives to hopefully not get divorced. And as a result, I waited until I feel like I knew who I was and what I wanted out of life before I got married. And for me, I think that worked well. And finding, obviously, my husband and, a very good soulmate. But we should talk about these things, right? And I said, you can fall in love with somebody. It doesn't mean you're going to want the same things in life. And that ultimately is what matters. Before we move to 5 questions that I love to ask every guest, is there anything you would like to say either about your book, your personal experience, your professional experience that you would like listeners to leave the conversation with?
I'd like to say that even if you think you don't have an interest in prisons and prisoners, I'd love you to read my book, because there's so much more to it than that. It is about relationships. It's about home. It's about love and loss and grief. It's about how we cope with life when we're dealt a blow, when life gives us a curveball. It is meant to be inspirational. But also I think that for people who dismiss prisons and prisoners, think that it's not part of their world, you just never know. One of the questions that I always ask to prison architects is, when you're designing this new prison, imagine a relative of yours being in it. Can you design a space that, your mother or niece or brother or uncle or whoever would not only survive in, but could thrive and flourish? And that always knocks them for 6, because they've never thought about that. They've never thought about themselves or a relative of theirs being in prison. And I think that's really interesting, because when architects sit down to design a hospital, they can imagine being in hospital. They'll have been in hospital, or they'll have relatives that have been in hospital. Schools, we've all been to school. We all know what schools could look like, how they could be improved. Old people, elderly care homes, similarly, we can imagine getting old and what we might need. No architect ever envisions themselves in a prison or any of their relatives. And I always find it very interesting that politicians sometimes have a sort of road to Damascus moment. If they get into trouble and they end up in prison themselves, they become great prison reformists. And I think it's really unfortunate that prisons are so separated and sequestered from society. You know, I just think it is all our responsibility to think about these things and talk about them. So I would love people to read my book with an open mind. And as you said earlier, you know, to have their curiosity piqued, to learn, you know, to have their minds expanded and not just think she's wrong or you know, want to confirm their own sort of preconceptions.
Love it. Well, everybody should read the book. Everybody should think more about prisons. There's just a lot of work to do. As I explore in my brand, âme attendre, which is French for to take care of your soul, so very fitting to our discussion today, objects can hold a lot of meaning for us. They can tie us to the past, enable us to enjoy the present, and even take us into the future. I know you said earlier you got rid of a lot of objects when you moved homes, but can you share an object from your life? And it doesn't have to be something that you still physically own, but something that could be something that you remember. Tell us why it had a lot of meaning for you.
Okay. So I'm going to cheat a bit and say 2 objects, partly because you're right, I got rid of so much. One is this bracelet, which
beautiful.
My grandmother, Evelyn, gave to me for my 18th birthday. And it was given to her by her sister Marjorie, my great aunt Marjorie, for her 21st birthday in the 1920s or 30s. I'm not sure exactly when now. But Marjorie was a nurse and it cost a whole month's wages to buy this bracelet. And my grandmother wrote me a really sweet note with it saying that she hoped that it would get lots of outings and excursions. And it hasn't really, because it's so kind of, it's quite bling. You know?
It's very fancy.
It's quite fancy and I don't go to many fancy occasions. But just to have that kind of connection with Evelyn and Marjorie and, you know, just own something so old and that was so meaningful to her. That's really special. And then the other thing is Nick gave me this well before my book was published. And it's an early form of photography, a cyanotype. Apparently it's where we get the term blueprint from. It's blue and can you see?
Yes.
It's basically a photograph of his cell window with the light coming in. So you can see that and it's blue and it's got the light coming in. We didn't know it at the time. My book cover hadn't been designed at the time, but my book cover is so similar.
Amazing.
Yeah. Obviously it's meaningful to me now. He gave that to me when he was a student in the creative writing group at Grendon. We didn't know each other very well then. We had no plans to, certainly no plans to write a book together. He's become very important in my life, and his family have as well. I speak to his mum on the phone 2 or 3 times a week. That picture for me is a kind of symbol of the future, of looking into the future and this new writer's life that I've created for myself. And, I'm so excited at the possibilities for this. Nick will hopefully be out of prison this year. That will make writing the book so much easier. But just the process of writing with someone else and being able to change their life. My life was changed in writing An Architecture of Hope, and now I'm passing that forward. And I think this will change his life. I think it already is. And I look to the future and I imagine us on the stage of a literature festival talking about our book. And it's kind of mind-blowing, for this man who's been in prison for 20 years. So yeah, that picture is symbolic of his freedom and my freedom as well, actually.
It's beautiful. I love it. Can you share a favorite tradition with us? It could be something that you did when you were a child or something you do today. It could revolve around food or travel or anything.
The thing that comes immediately to mind is a roast dinner on a Sunday. It was quite a ritual in my house growing up. And, I talk in the book about the fact that my father was an alcoholic and he died very young. He died at the age of 54 of alcohol-related illnesses. He was quite a difficult man to live with in many ways. He had quite a violent temper. But he loved cooking Sunday lunch. And it was a sort of moment in the week when he would be in a really good mood, playful, and he'd have classical music playing in the background on the radio. And he would cook a roast chicken or something like that and all the trimmings. And we'd eat at the dining table, which we never normally did. You know, we were the sort of family that ate on our laps in front of the telly. But cooking a roast chicken dinner is such a sensory pleasure, and it's such an act of giving and love and generosity, I think. And it's something that ties a lot of us to the past, I imagine. It evokes feelings of warmth and companionship and comfort and nostalgia. And, you know, of course, it's good for us as well, nutritionally. Apologies to all the vegans and vegetarians out there. But it's present in so many different cultures in different forms, isn't it? And whenever I cook a roast dinner for anyone, it feels like a beautiful act of love.
I couldn't agree more, both about food and love being sort of intertwined. And these memories, I mean, that's beautiful. It's really beautiful. It also is a nice segue into the next question, which is whether you enjoy entertaining in your home today or not.
Well, I've only been here a year. Lots of people have come to visit me because Bath is a beautiful city. It's a World Heritage Site. So it's a big tourist attraction. So lots of people come and see me because they really want to come to Bath. I haven't had a dinner party or anything like that. You know, too much stress. I spent a lot of my time in my late 20s and 30s holding dinner parties and going to dinner parties. I've done it. I don't want to go back there. I love having friends around for a glass of wine. I do that quite a lot. But in general, I think I much prefer deep, meaningful conversations with one other person over a bottle of wine than a crowd round a table that I have to cook for. That's the truth of it.
No, I understand. And I feel like we have seasons in our life where we want to do that more or less. I'm going to forget the title of the book, but beautiful book about gathering. And to me, like, one of the big takeaways is if you do, or either at your own home or you're at a gathering where, you know, not a huge number of people around the table, but let's say 6 to 8 people or so, if you choose a question or a topic, you can have really deep, interesting conversations with a larger group. It just takes like a little bit more effort and work, and people have to make themselves vulnerable, you know, but you would be surprised. People will.
It has to be quite egalitarian though as well. You know, it's sort of ruined when one person wants to dominate.
Yeah, it has to be managed, I would say. Yes, definitely. Which takes work. You know, not everybody's up for that. Yeah. Do you have one or two top resources, books, websites, podcasts, courses that you can recommend? Obviously, your book will be one of them. But if there's anything else.
I read a lot of memoirs, and there are quite a lot that I could recommend. But unfortunately, the one that I really want to recommend is about prisons. But it's another book that I would say anybody could read and get something out of. It's not really about prisons. It's about the human condition. It's about existence. And it's called I Will Never See the World Again by a Turkish journalist and novelist called Ahmet Altan, who was a political prisoner. And he was imprisoned, and as the title suggests, he thought that he would die in prison. Eventually, Amnesty International helped with his release. He was taken back into prison, but he's now, again, a free man. He's got the inquiring mind and keen eye of a journalist, but the soul of a poet. And it's the most beautifully written memoir. Andy and I use it in all our classes. We teach creative writing retreats and workshops, as well as teaching in prisons. And we always do some writing exercises around Ahmet Altan's book, I Will Never See the World Again. And everybody universally loves it and goes on to recommend it to other people. Even if, you know, they have no connection with prisons, they have no connection with criminology. It's just one of those books that is so beautifully written and sort of life enhancing.
Well, I'm definitely going to read it. That sounds amazing. Last question. What do you do for yourself? Do you have a practice, a focus, a habit, or daily routine that contributes to your success or well-being?
Well, during lockdown, there were 3 things that I did every day, which I'm trying to get back into because they really benefited me physically and mentally. It's the holy trinity of reading, writing, and running. I'm trying to get back. It's hard to find the time sometimes. Reading especially can feel like a guilty pleasure, especially reading non-academic books for me. As I say to all my creative writing students, you have to be a good reader. You have to be an avid reader. You have to read widely and deeply in order to be a good writer. So I need to get over that feeling of guilt and practice doing some reading for myself every day, I think. The running, I will. When the weather gets a bit warmer, it's still quite cold here. Bath is very hilly, which has been putting me off so far. And writing, I think it's good to have writing practice, whether that's morning pages, journaling, or kind of writing that I'm doing. I think any kind of self-expression that gets stuff out of here and onto the page, that's good for us.
Yeah, out of the brain and the heart and onto the page.
Yeah.
Yes, amazing.
Absolutely.
Yvonne, thank you so much for joining me today. It has been an absolute pleasure talking with you. I have learned a lot. I have books to read and more to do, and I always love ending a conversation that way. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
I've really enjoyed it, Ashley. Thank you so much. It's been a great experience.
Thanks for listening to an episode of On the Table with Ashley. Subscribing to, rating, and reviewing our podcast helps us to continue to record great interviews. So please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you're interested in learning more about the products we talked about on the show, visit amattendre.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com to check them out. When you become a member by sharing your email on our website, we'll share special discounts that relate to products discussed on each episode. Finally, email us at reachoutanytime@amattendre.com with thoughts you have or ideas for topics or guests for future episodes. Thanks for listening.